Hi, I'm Bob Gimlin. Regarding the Bigfoot riddle, a lot of people like to cite Murphy's Law, being a circumstance wherein everything that can go wrong goes wrong. I call it the perfect storm. These creatures seem to have every advantage in the skirmish against verification. They have the high ground, so to speak. Murphy's Law, the perfect storm, are universally applicable to this subject. Note the intrinsic difficulty of trying to prove that something that looks like a man isn't. Be it the media's lackluster approach, or the college's lack of approach, or even that dark, dark forest. We just can't seem to get a grip. Even when a corpse is potentially within inches of a biologist. I'm going to try to explain what the Minnesota Iceman is and what happened to it. The Minnesota Iceman is a perfect example of Bigfoot evidence, and in this case proof, that was ignored, mishandled, and subsequently forgotten, just because of what it was. Anyhow, like many great stories, this one begins in the 60s. A man named Frank Hansen began touring an alleged body of a Bigfoot-like creature in the American Midwest and Canada. It was an unusual addition to Hansen's display, seeing as his collection was mostly antiquated tractors. In 1960, Hansen was in the United States Air Force. He served as a captain with the 343rd Fighter Group in Duluth, Minnesota. He went on a hunting foray with 2 lieutenants and a major, in a marshy location some 60 miles north of Duluth at a location called Whiteface Reservoir. The area only accessible in spring and summer by swamp buggy. Hansen said that he and his companions split up. The only official statement, written by Hansen himself, was published in 1970 edition of Saga magazine. Hansen writes, "In the middle of a small clearing, there were 3 hairy creatures that at first looked like bears. 2 of these creatures were on their knees, tearing at the inside of a freshly killed deer. The deer's innards were scattered around the clearing, and the things were scooping blood from the stomach cavity into the palms of their human-like hands. Raising their cupped hands of fresh blood to their mouths, they swallowed the liquid. The 3rd creature was about 10 yards away, on the edge of the clearing, crouched on his haunches. It was obvious he was a male of similar stature as a man. Absolute horror gripped every muscle of my body as I stared at this frightening tableau before me. I felt as if my body had turned to stone. Without warning, the male leaped straight into the air from its crouched position. His arms jerked upward, high over his head, and he let out a weird screeching sound. Screeching and screaming, he charged toward me. I cannot remember aiming my rifle, nor do I recall pulling the trigger, but a bullet must have slammed into the beast's body. As blood spurted from his face, the huge creature staggered, seemingly stunned by this unexpected happening. I do not recall ejecting my spent shell, nor do I recall firing my rifle again. In many sweat-drenched nightmares, however, I have vividly envisioned the blood-covered face lying on the ground beside the mutilated deer. I have absolutely no recollection of ever seeing the other 2 creatures again. They seem to have vanished into thin air. Blind with fear, I started to run. I dashed over the swampy terrain, not knowing or caring in which direction I ran. My only thought was to get away from those horrible things. I stumbled, fell, picked myself up, and fell again. I thought they were right behind me. Finally, I fell onto the frozen marshland, completely exhausted, not caring if the creatures caught me. I lay there waiting for the attack. I have no recollection of time, and my mind blanked out. Saga was the only periodical that bothered to publish Hansen's recount. I guess it was too troubling for major news sources, who long ago decided that Bigfoot is bunk. Of course, the 1960s predate the research of bioacoustics and infrasound. We have since learned that large, intelligent animals, like killer whales and tigers, can disorient and even paralyze prey with bursts of inaudible infrasonic frequencies, which cause a regular nerve impulse and basically interrupt brain signal. That's according to the Fauna Research Institute. A concept detailed and supported by the two scientists with the American Institute of Physics. An experiment was conducted wherein the two scientists intermittently played infrasound at various levels during a concert without the audience's knowledge. About a fourth of the concert-goers reported inexplicable and unusual episodes of disorientation, fear, nausea, and dread. Impressive, seeing as the infrasound produced was shoddy at best, and basically just speakers playing low frequency into a funnel of 30 feet of copper pipe. Dr. Weissman and Dr. Lord concluded that at even low levels, infrasound can, quote, cause unusual experiences, even though infrasound is not consciously detected. Hansen said that the creature's, quote, arms jerked upward high over his head, and he let out a weird screeching sound. Screeching and screaming, he charged toward me. End quote. I felt as if my body had turned to stone. End quote. I cannot remember aiming my rifle, nor do I recall pulling the trigger, but a bullet must have slammed into the beast's body. I do not recall ejecting my spent shell, nor do I recall firing my rifle again. I have absolutely no recollection of ever seeing the other two creatures again. They seem to have vanished into thin air. I have no recollection of time, and my mind blanked out. Infrasound can cause unusual experiences, even though infrasound is not consciously detected. Sounds an awful lot like a creature made a noise that caused confusion, dread, fear, and mental or even physical incapacitation, as we know other mammals can. Sounds an awful lot like a man describing an experience for which there was not yet a name for. And I do have a video that goes far deeper into the implications and details of biological infrasonic implementation. Hansen tells in many more words that, after coming to, he fires the distress signal of 3 shots into the air, and after some call and response, he locates his companions. He also mentions that the compass his friend lent him was broken. He makes no indication that this was anything other than faulty equipment, but it does make a person wonder. By the way, he shot the creature with his 8mm customized Mauser. He didn't mention the incident to his hunting buddies. They were technically his subordinates, and he didn't want to damage his reputation or risk a psychological inquest, seeing as he was only 5 years away from military retirement. More importantly, however, he writes that he really just wanted to get out of the woods, and that mentioning the creature to his companions would surely force him to return to them. He suffered from nightmares and turned to pills and drinking for comfort, so much so that he avoided flying as much as possible, being an AirForce captain. Time passed and he began to question his sanity. Perhaps it was a dream. As easily occurs in situations like this, paranoia set in. Did it actually happen? And if so, what did he shoot? Was it an unverified animal? Though keep in mind, this was 7 years before the Patterson-Gimlin film. Did he shoot a mentally ill or feral person? An escapee from the various sanatoriums of the 50s and 60s? He needed answers and closure, so he set out to find the corpse, alone. But wisely, he waited for the first snow. That way he could backtrack his steps, were he to get disoriented, which tends to happen if your compass fails. In December of that year, after a dusting of snow, with the help of chains and his swamp buggy, he found the specimen. He verified that it was not a human. His intention was to get rid of it, so that it wasn't stumbled upon come hunting season. Obviously, unable to bury it in the frozen soil, he wrapped it up in some tarp and kept it frozen in a meat freezer in his basement. He must have had an interesting conversation with his wife. But there it sat, for 5 years, out of sight, out of mind. There probably never really seems like a good time to dispose of the corpse of a frozen ape man. Then he retired and began touring his antique tractors across the Midwest. During this time, he decided that what he had was too important to simply bury. But he also didn't want to be the particular person to provide, as he had decided it was, the quote, missing link, which was kind of a hot-button issue at that time. So he wanted to gauge public opinion subtly, instead of ripping off the Band-Aid. With that retirement money, he bought a slightly larger freezer, froze the sucker into a block of ice, and installed a transparent lid, thus adding, quote, the man left over from the Ice Age to his collection of tractors. He says he wanted to see firsthand people's reaction to the creature before it was thrust upon them by the media. And from 1965 to 1967, he toured the specimen, a corridor preview, with no incident. Until 1967, when a zoology student named Terry Cullen happened upon the exhibit in Milwaukee. He found the creature to be remarkable. He could find no reason to suggest that the creature was a fabrication, but found many reasons to suggest the alternative. He wrote letters to professors and peers, but not one of his colleagues could be bothered to examine the specimen themselves, which sounds about right for my experience. I imagine with some indignation, he reached out to, quote, cryptozoologists. Later in 1967, Ivan Sanderson, a Scottish-born biologist and author of Abominable Snowman, the story of subhumans on 5 continents from the early Ice Age until today, as well as Bernard Weylemans, a Belgian scientist and author of On the Track of Unknown Animals, and often considered the father of cryptozoology, both flew to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to examine the display for themselves. They had little to no confidence that they were going to see anything other than a forgery, but they were shocked by what they saw. The 2 men spent 3 nights examining the specimen in a cramped trailer. The 2 researchers were not expecting much of anything, but were more than convinced by what they saw. Weylemans wrote at length of the creature, but a comprehensive summation of his findings can be found published in the Bulletin of the Royal Institute of Natural Sciences, Belgium. He wrote, the specimen at first looks like a man, or if you prefer, an adult being of male sex, of rather standard height, 6 feet, and proportions, but excessively hairy. It is entirely covered with very dark brown hair, 3 to 4 inches long. Its skin appears wax-like, similar in color to the cadavers of white men, not tanned by the sun. The specimen is lying on its back. The left arm is twisted behind the head, with the palm of the hand upward. The arm makes a strange curve, as if it were that of a sawdust doll, but this curvature is due to an open fracture midway between the wrist and the elbow, where one can distinguish the broken ulna in a gaping wound. The right arm is twisted and held tightly against the flank, with the hand spread palm down over the right side of the abdomen. Between the right finger and the medius, the penis is visible, lying obliquely on the groin. The testicles are vaguely distinguishable at the juncture of the thighs. Weylemans also speculates that Hansen's story of his acquisition of the Iceman is probably false and made for the purpose of drama, or hide some black market deal involving transportation when he was in the AirForce. Ivan Sanderson wrote in Argosy, May of 1969, Bozo, as Sanderson called the specimen, his face is his most startling feature, both to anthropologists and anyone else, and for several reasons. Unfortunately, both eyeballs have been blown out of their sockets. One appears to be missing, but the other seems to be just visible under the ice. This gives Bozo a gruesome appearance, which is enhanced by a considerable amount of blood diffused from the sockets through the ice. The most arresting feature of the face is the nose. This is large, but only fairly wide, and is distinctly pugged, rather like that of a Pekingese dog, and not like that of a gorilla, which actually doesn't have a nose per se. The nostrils are large, circular, and point straight forward, which is very odd. The mouth is only fairly wide, and there is no eversion of the lips. In fact, the average person would say he has no lips at all. But his muzzle is no more bulging, prominent, or pushed forward than our own. Not at all prognathous, like that of a chimp. One side of the mouth is slightly agape, and 2 small teeth can be seen. These should be the right upper canine and the first premolar. The canine, or eye tooth, is very small and in no way exaggerated into a tusk, not similar to that of a gorilla. But to me, at least, the most interesting feature of all are some folds and wrinkle lines around the mouth just below the cheeks. These are absolutely human and are like those seen in a heavy-jowled, older white man. End quote. As one would expect, Sanderson and Weylemans describe a mix of ape and human features, Both mention human proportions, an obvious bipedalism, also human-like dentition, lacking prominent canine teeth, also lacking human-like lips, as is consistent with chimp and gorilla, and a completely unfamiliar nose. They were confident that the specimen was of an actual creature. Remember in the beginning of this when I alluded to the perfect storm that seems to plague Bigfoot research? This is where it starts. Sanderson and Wavelmans made their publications, and Hansen got cold feet. And as often happens when panic sets in, details get fuzzy. The Smithsonian called the affair a hoax, refusing Hansen's invitation to actually inspect the creature for themselves. Hansen contacted an attorney, who warned him, quote, "If you're not careful, you may end up in a prison cell," depending on the nature of what was in the box and just exactly how he could or could not prove how it got there. Hansen, of course, was also a religious man. He was receiving substantial flack from the religious right, prominent in Minnesota, especially in the 60s, but still so today, for propagating the myth of evolution. Even today, Creation.com has a few articles specifically discrediting the Minnesota Iceman for promoting the falsehood of a missing link and therefore evolution. Then something happened. Hansen took his display to Canada, but a replica returned. He claims that he hid the real deal. Wavelmans and Sanderson re-inspected the body in 1969 and indeed found numerous indication that the creature was swapped with a replica, just as Hansen had publicly declared. Hansen said in his article to Saga that he will release the original under two conditions. First, a statement of complete amnesty for any possible violation of federal law, and two, a statement of complete amnesty for any possible violation of state and local laws where the specimen was transported or exhibited during the 1968 fair season. Those terms were never met, but I don't think he had the original corpse upon returning to America anyway, after dealing with customs. But indeed, he did consult John Chambers, a costume designer with 20th Century Fox, about a model that cost Hansen $20,000. To be clear, he had already been exhibiting a specimen for years before he had any contact with the model maker. It is he himself who claims that the creature shown after 1969 is a replica. Wavelmans and Sanderson confirmed that the specimen they examined in '69 was not the same specimen they examined in 1967. So how could the holy grail of Bigfootdom disappear without a trace? How could arguably the most important specimen of all time vanish? Well, that's the perfect storm I keep alluding to. Academia couldn't even bother to send a correspondent or request for an inquest. And the key to this disappearance is in that 1969 border crossing. Personally, I think some government agency, with an acronym we've never heard of, said, "Let us make this disappear, or we'll make you disappear," and Hansen obliged. A buyout may have even sounded ideal if he found himself way over his head, which he probably did. And why am I so confident that this was the real deal? Well, I have a few reasons. As far as I can tell, only 3 people with any kind of training actually observed it. The zoology student Terry Cullen, Sanderson, and Wavelmans. And they were all convinced. Think about it. The Smithsonian called it a hoax, without so much as a glance or request for an inquest. So we have no choice but to defer to the professionals who actually bothered to look at the thing. Hansen was an officer in the AirForce. When someone with a higher rank than him told him to do something, he did it. So it isn't unlikely that this disappeared. In fact, I would argue that it is more than likely that it would disappear. After 1967, the exhibit gave off a foul odor. Skeptics claim that this is an old Carney trick to keep lines flowing smoothly and keep prying eyes from lingering. But Wavelmans notes that there was no smell until the heat of his spotlight made a hairline fracture in the glass. Only then did the thing start to stink. Would a forger really stuff such a masterpiece with dead possums on the off chance that the glass broke? And by the way, Hansen was no carny, which is a socially degenerative word, by the way. Hansen was a captain in the U.S. Air Force. He showed tractors and this exhibit at state and county fairs, shopping mall openings, and things like that. Before internet, this is how people exhibited their wares. Hansen was no carny. He had something unusual, and he thought the world ought to see it. But someone of more authority thought people had seen enough. Another strange reason I think this is the real deal, and bear with me here, is that monkeys, apes, humans, proto-humans, no such thing as subhumans, hominoid, we all kinda look fake. I've mulled this over in my head a lot while studying orang and gorilla. Skin and fat clumps in weird ways, and not at all uniformed, like most animals we're used to seeing. Take a look at this bonobo. Its skin looks rubbery, almost like a wetsuit yanked over a mannequin that is much too small for it. The hair isn't really uniformed either, more randomly and sparsely placed than other animals. The face almost looks like a bad mask. And especially proportions look like someone tried to make a human-scale model, but just kinda did a bad job at it. And this goes back to that perfect storm metaphor. We are trying to film or prove something that just kind of looks fake. And the last reason I want to mention is something I'm certainly not the first to say, and applies to many aspects of the Bigfoot world. If these are all hoaxes, the craft, time, and skill taken to create them is surely wasted on anonymous letters, 30-second video clips, and 25-cent admission tickets to a tractor show. John Chambers, the ape costume guru of the era, appraised his replica at $20,000 in the year 1970, which, by the way, is roughly $100,000 in 2017. What was Hansen doing, wasting his time on 25-cent admission fees if he had that kind of skill? The same goes for Patterson and Gimlin. If Bigfoot is a hoax, then a lot of very talented people are involved, and they are absolutely and unequivocally wasting their lives. And this is just one strange chapter in a strange book. And though zoologists may not have a name for this, sociologists do. Cultural dissonance, which is the sociological term to describe the discomfort that arises from cultural inconsistencies, which are unexpected or unexplained, and therefore difficult for individuals to mentally negotiate or accept. And the Minnesota Iceman is a pristine example of the perfect storm of cultural dissonance. Discomfort that arises from cultural inconsistencies, which are unexpected or unexplained, and therefore difficult for individuals to mentally negotiate or accept. And there is no better example than the Minnesota Iceman, and why there is more than just bad luck at work in the effort to prove these things. But kudos to those of you who don't mind going out in the rain. And I realize that these videos take me a long time to make, but trust me, I'm just getting started. So make sure to like this video, subscribe for updates, never hesitate to shoot me a comment or question, and as always, thanks an awful lot for listening.